Working? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this lecture series. I'm very excited to announce that today Dr. Matthew McLean will be speaking. He's visiting us all the way from the Masters University in California. Dr. McLean did his PhD at Loma Linda University, and he is one of the foremost experts in paleontology, pterosaurs, a variety of things. Today he's going to talk about some mammals. And out of the many paleontologists I know, there are very few who are Christians. And Dr. McLean is not only a devoted and also we're very blessed to have him here today. So thank you for accepting my invitation to come talk today. All right, will you bow your heads for a word of prayer? Dear Lord, thank you for being with us on this beautiful Sabbath day. About fossils that are both interesting, but also weird and sometimes troublesome. I thank you for bringing him here safely. Be with him as he presents and as he travels home, and be with his family. In your loving name, amen.
Well, good afternoon. It's good. Thank you. It's good to see all of you. And yes, as you heard, I'm Dr. McLean. I live out in California. Yes, gas is very expensive. I'm at a private Christian university called the Masters University. It's just about an hour north of Los Angeles. And I am in the science department there. We have two science majors, a biology one and a geoscience one. So I'm kind of heading up geoscience, and then I also teach some biology classes, since paleontology is a combination of both of those things. And we are very involved in creationist research as well as just general science research at our university, encouraging students to get into it, which is really fun. In fact, what I'll be talking about today, a lot of it was research done by an undergraduate student. Some exciting. We are very interested in continuing growing our programs and things. In fact, we have a trip planned to the Grand Canyon for this summer. And we're looking for high school students who might be interested in that. So if any of you have, high school students in classes and things, and you want to know more information about that, I definitely can reach out to you. And I think we're looking at very early June, I think is the plan. So today I want to talk to you. The title of the talk is "This Little Mosschops Went to Market." Okay. And that's in reference to the thing you do with little kids, right? Like this little piggy went to market. But it's not a piggy, it's a Mosschops. And why we're talking about that, why using that reference, because we're going to look at fingers and toes today. What the fingers and toes tell us about the relationship of non-mammalian synapsids to mammals, okay? Normally, most of my work is on dinosaurs and pterosaurs and a few other kinds of reptile groups like this. But I have always been interested in these creatures, been wanting to get into studying them for a long time. And just in the last few years, I've been able to make some headway on that, and especially trying to understand them from a creationist standpoint. And we'll get into why that's important in a little bit. But first, we have to answer the question, what is a Mosschops? Okay. This is Mosschops. Mosschops is a wonderful animal. I mean, it's dead now, but it was not little. Okay, you could ride it if you wanted. It would probably be about the size of like a small hippo. Okay, so get up to about here in the shoulder height. You might be able to look it in the face. And it's very strangely proportioned. Okay, it has a big barrel chest, really big forelimbs, and also powerful hind limbs, and a tiny tail in the back. Okay, so it would have had this kind of big chest, walk around like a bodybuilder kind of thing. And the head of this animal is particularly interesting. It is reinforced with extra bone there. Okay, so it has a very thick, bony head. We see this kind of thing in some dinosaurs as well as some other animals too. And it's typically thought to be associated with headbutting behavior. And this is particularly likely in this animal because they took its skull, you can see at the bottom there, and put it in through a CT scan to look at the brain. Okay, now human brains are kind of, just overall kind of a big blob kind of shape. But a lot of animals, the brains are kind of longer, linear. And the long axis of the brain is usually aligned with how you hold up your head. And you can find the semicircular canals in the ears and those kinds of things. And you can see how an animal would normally carry its head around. In Mosschops, unlike most other animals we know about, the brain is actually aligned kind of weirdly. You can see the long axis of the green there. Instead of having its head up like this, it would walk around with its head like this everywhere it went. And it actually makes sense when you look at the skull because the eyes would point kind of forward like that. And it has a very large pineal opening, what we call a third eye. So if you've ever had like a bearded dragon or you've seen animals like tuatara, as we'll see those later, they actually have a third eye up here. They can't use it to like form images or anything. It's mainly for sensing changes in daylight and seasons and those kinds of things. But it has a very large one up there right around the thickened area, okay? So it's keeping its head down like this everywhere it goes, looking around, because it's probably going to be ramming its head into stuff, and that suited that animal well, okay? Now, what kind of an animal is Mosschops? Mosschops, not only does it not exist anymore, but the group of animals it's in doesn't exist anymore either, and we call those non-mammalian synapsids. Now, it's probably not a term most of you have heard of before, but you've probably seen this guy before. Okay, this is Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon is a pretty big animal also, so they could get up to 12 feet long, maybe even a little longer. So think about like a long alligator is kind of the idea with this, but having a big fin on its back, okay? And Dimetrodon, you look at that first, you think, okay, that kind of looks like a reptile. And it has a lot of similarities with reptiles, but it also has some differences, okay? And other members of this group, the Synapsids, than what we're used to for reptiles. So here is a Dicynodon. This one's Cannemyria, also a pretty big animal. And these guys had beaks in the front, like a bird, okay? But they also had tusks. So they'd have like two big tusks that would stick out, and most of them had a beak and no teeth in the rest of the mouth. And it's kind of like a pig, but with a beak on it and some tusks, okay? And they could get from the size of elephants all the way down to like size of a mole rat, okay? So they're very, very variable in that. And then you also get things like this. This is a Gorgonopsian. These, you look at it first, you're like, oh, it kind of reminds me of a wolf or a dog. Yeah, in fact, there's one genus of Gorgonopsian called Lycanops. It means wolf face, okay? They kind of have that look, the big canines, saber-tooth kind of face, but then they've also got some similarities with reptiles too. The arms and the legs are kind of sprawled a little bit. They're not straight up and down. And there's some other differences we'll talk about a little bit later. And so these animals don't really fit very nicely into any classification scheme we have right now, any living group. And so they have some similarities with reptiles and some with mammals. And traditionally, people called them mammal-like reptiles. That's unfortunate, though, because they're not actually reptiles, just like they're not actually mammals either. So it's kind of like saying koala bear, right? It's not really a bear, but it looks like one. And of course, evolutionists use this as support for the idea that these are transitional animals between reptiles and mammals, okay? But the similarities that are here between reptiles and mammals, these were established even before evolutionary theory was popular. So Richard Owen was one of the first people to look at one of these, and he had a Dicynodon described from South Africa, and he said, yeah, it's a pretty reptile-like skull overall. He saw the really big tusk, and he said, let's cut it open, because that's, he could do whatever he wanted. And he cut it open, and sure enough, on the inside, it looked like a mammal tooth. He said it's constantly growing, just like the incisors in some mammals. And so he said, well, this is kind of weird. It's an animal that's kind of like a reptile, kind of like a mammal, but, he wasn't thinking evolutionarily. And he said, okay, the creator decided to make such a creature to fit its particular environment and what it did. And these animals, I told you they're extinct, we only find their fossils, you think about the geologic column, I'll show you that later, kind of in the middle of the column, okay? So we only find it between the Carboniferous and the Cretaceous. Most of them are between the Carboniferous and the Triassic, as kind of the range that you typically find there. And like I said, in the evolutionary model, this group is thought to include the ancestors of mammals, okay? So we'll see some reasons why they suggest that in just a moment. So you can see up there, there's a kind of an evolutionary tree, a diagram there, and you can see Dimetrodon at the top, we already talked about, and lots of other animals, and then at the bottom you have some mammals you're familiar with. There's a possum and a platypus. And they're showing you there a proposed evolutionary series from these non-mammalian synapsids to true mammals. And so when you look at these animals, there seems to be a trend of increasing mammalness, being more like a mammal, okay? And there's a few different areas you can look at. Posture is one of them. So when you start with an animal like Dimetrodon, it's very sprawling, kind of more like an alligator in the way it would walk. Whilst like Gorgonopsian or Probognathus up there, they'd actually have their legs more underneath their bodies, more like a mammal, which you find typically. The one that gets the most attention is the jaws and the ears, okay? And this is considered, this sequence of jaw and ear evolution by many evolutionists is considered the best transitional sequence between two classes in the fossil record, between reptiles and mammals. So we're not going to go into detail about this today, but I want to at least kind of show you what they're talking about. If you look at Dimetrodon at the top up there, they show you its lower jaw right next to it, and its lower jaw has lots of colors because it has lots of different bones in it, okay? Our lower jaws are made of one bone, so it's just the dentary. But in Dimetrodon, you've got dentaries and articulars and the angular and the surangular, all kinds of fun stuff. When you make your way into the cynodonts, you see that there are still lower jaw bones, but they're much smaller. The dentary takes up even more and more of the mouth. And then eventually, when you get to things like Gorgonopsian or Dimetrodon on the bottom there, the bones are tiny. They're still there, but they're really small. They're at the back of the jaw, and they're on the tympanic membrane. And the thinking is, in the evolutionary model, that those bones keep getting smaller and smaller, they detach from the jaw, and they become some of our ear bones. Okay, so specifically the incus and the malleus, and a little bit of the surrounding kind of bone too. And you might think, oh, that sounds kind of fanciful, that could happen. But it turns out mammals, as they develop, and we've looked at possums and other animals, platypus, things like that, as an embryo, bones do originate from the same pharyngeal arch as the jaw, okay, the lower jaw. And so even before evolution was proposed, way back in the 1830s, I think, there was a German anatomist who was dissecting pigs and pig embryos, and he said, hey, look, it turns out that some of our ear bones are derived from one area of the embryo, and one of them is derived from a different part. And so he was just, he wasn't thinking about evolution, he was describing what he saw, but evolutionists jumped on that as, there you go, what they say, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So the development of an animal copies its evolutionary ancestry, is the argument. We're not going to look at this today. This is a very complex issue, but I want you to know that they are used in this way. What we're going to focus on today, and there's some examples of some jaws of a cynodont, we're going to look at hands and feet. So this is kind of an ongoing project. I'm going to share with you some preliminary results, but this is something that I've been working with several students over 5 years so far, trying to understand these creatures from a biblical creationist perspective. And it's been really exciting for me. I've been really enjoying it, but we still have lots of questions. So for instance, the jaw to ear thing, we're still working through that. We're still trying to read literature and find out different things. There are some really exciting things going on. I want to share that with you today. But before we can get there, you got to understand some of these particular synapsid animals. Okay, so when we start with Dimetrodon here, Dimetrodon and his relatives are called pelycosaurs, and these are more on the reptile-like kind of thing. You'd look at them and you'd say, "Oh, that kind of looks like a reptile." That's what you'd think. But as you move along here, you hit animals called therapsids. Okay, and these are supposed to be the most mammal-like of the synapsids. So there's 6 different groups later, okay, but we are going to talk about them throughout. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them to you. There's the Barominologians, there's the Dinocephalians. Mosschops is a Dinocephalian, which means terrible head, by the way. So you can call somebody that. No, you shouldn't do that. Okay, Anomodonts. So this includes our Dicynodonts, the ones with beaks. We have the Gorgonopsians. We already talked about those. The Therocephalians and the Cynodonts. And the Cynodonts are the most mammal-like of the therapsids. So if we're going to do a little Russian nesting doll thing here, you've got Synapsida, you take off the pelycosaur shell, you have therapsids, you take off that shell, you have Cynodonts, and then you'd have mammals down there. Okay, so that's kind of the order of how mammal-like these creatures are. So what I show you up here, this is obviously simplified, but the idea is that there is the evolutionists would say that there's a nice progression moving from more reptile-like creatures through the therapsids to the most mammal-like ones. They would say it's a spectrum, okay? And like I said, this is considered one of the best transitional sequences in the fossil record. In fact, it's been referred to as the crown jewel of evolution, okay? And surprisingly, even though it's called the crown jewel of evolution, very little exists in like the popular literature on these animals. Everybody just talks about dinosaurs this, dinosaurs that, right? And these things get ignored, okay? In the technical literature, there's tons and tons of stuff. But for the layperson, there's almost nothing out there. I tried to find a recent book that was designed for lay people, and the only one I found since like the 1980s was a book that's called Evolutionary Slam Dunk. And the subtitle is something like Why Anti-Evolutionists Are Wrong About Synapsids and What It Means or something. And it's a very inflammatory, but you can guess, right, from the title. And actually, it's funny, I was trying to find something like this. I was talking to synapsid workers on Twitter and getting their, like, hey, are you guys working on any books or anything going to come out? And this guy jumped in the conversation. He's like, you should check out my book, and he's like trying to get me as a creationist to buy it. I mean, he didn't know I was a creationist, but he's like, you're going to love it. And I didn't. It's not that good. I feel bad. I mean, yeah, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but the book is not written that well. And it doesn't have a lot of pictures, nothing to color. So it's we want to talk about them, though, because these are God's creatures, and they show His glory, and there's some really amazing things here. I already showed you some amazing creatures. But I wanted to understand these as a creationist, because if this really is the crown jewel of evolution, right? If this is the best example of evolution out there, then that's something we got to look at, right? And so when we think about what the Bible says about the origins of things, and the Bible is very clear about origins, the Bible describes animals during the creation week, right? So on day 5, it talks about swimming creatures and flying creatures. On day 6, it says that He makes beasts of the field and creeping things and livestock. And eventually it says humans as well, right? So thinking about that, it makes sense that there would be different kinds of animals that don't all share common ancestry, okay? If you're just reading what the biblical text says. And for sure, we know humans have a separate ancestry than the other animals. That's explicitly described in Scripture. And since humans are considered mammals, and the evolutionists would say we would find our ancestry in creatures like a Stemanasuchus here, which is by far the best animal that's ever existed. It's great. Okay, it's such a weird animal. Okay, but anyway, since we would find our ancestry shared with these things in the evolutionary model, I look at that and say, well, hold on, that doesn't really make any sense. That doesn't fit with what the Bible said. So I worked with some students, and we started doing what's called Barominology on these things, and we've been able to publish our results in different in a journal of creation theology and science. Society and Creation Geology Society joint meeting. It happens every summer in July. You are more than welcome to attend. This next year, it's at Patrick Henry College in Virginia, and I think it's like a Tuesday through Thursday this time, I want to say, but they kind of change it up. And we move around the country. We do different places each year, but it's a scientific creationist conference. So it's not just like apologetics or something that you'd hear like in a church setting. It's actually someone's want feedback. So it's a really cool opportunity for scientists to meet together and talk about creation research. And so we did several different publications over, like I said, since 2017, looking at these creatures, and we've been trying to understand them. And as I said, we use something called barominology, okay? And this is the study of created kinds. And so this is a uniquely creationist field of research. And what you want to do is figure out, can we determine whether or not there are different created kinds of creatures and what those would be, okay? And so the prediction is, like we said, from the Bible, that there should be distinct created kinds of animals. Now, within those created kinds, since God created things, and the history that's happened since then, animals can diversify, right? So we have tons of types of dogs today. We got tons of breeds of dogs. You got pugs and cocker spaniels and greyhounds. And then you've even got wild dogs, right? Like, African wild dogs or wolves or coyotes or bush dogs or raccoon dogs, maned wolves. There's all kinds of cool stuff out there. All of those, we think, probably come from the same ancestor, an animal that would have gotten off the ark, well, two animals would have gotten off the ark, and they would have had the ability to change over time within boundaries, okay? So the idea is in barominology, you want to find what creatures share continuity with each other, that means they're very similar to each other, and are discontinuous from all other creatures. And if you can find that combination of a group of creatures that are united by continuity and bounded by discontinuity, that's probably getting close to the created kind. You're approximating it, is the idea. And so we tried this out on Synapsids, okay? We wanted to see, is it really one continuous spectrum, or is it actually punctuated? And so this is just one example from the Synapsids. One little square at the top, one bigger square, and then a bigger square, and then a bigger square, okay? And when we look at what are called the multidimensional scaling results, and you can see those right there, here each different species is a little dot there, and I've color-coded them based on the major groups we see. And if they're close together, they're very similar, and if they're far away, they're very different. And so you can see there's a yellow cluster up there, a red cluster that's very far away from the other things. The blue and the green are pretty close, and so it's a little bit hard to tell. That could be one created kind, it could be two. But the point is, it's not just one big spectrum, right? And we've been collecting, well, not me personally, scientists have been collecting fossils of these for ever since the 1800s, okay? So it's not like, oh, these are new animals and we just don't have very many fossils. Remember, this is supposed to be the crown jewel. This is supposed to be the best example. And yet, what do we see? It is punctuated by discontinuity. And so what I did with one of my students is we looked at all of these. She focused on Synodonts, I did the rest of them. And what we found was that, sure enough, each one of these groups was not connected. There was discontinuity, separating the group from the other ones. And in fact, every single one of those groups not only showed discontinuity around it, but even within the group, we usually found a few separate groups we think are created kinds. And so we would estimate, a low estimate here is probably like 12 to 14 different created kinds. It could be much higher, just depending on what future analyses tell us and what fossils we haven't discovered. But the point is, it's not just a gradational, nice spectrum there. It really is punctuated. And that is not what evolution would predict, okay? So that's cool, and we were encouraged by that this is what we predicted as a creationist, and sure enough, it's what we found. The statistical methods didn't have to show us a spectrum, and it didn't. But then we've got to actually deal with some of these trends, right? It's cool to be able to say, oh yeah, there's separate groups here, but why do they show up in the order they do in the fossil record? Why can we see trends with things like jaws and ears and fingers and toes? And so fingers and toes, I hadn't thought about this much a few years ago, but I started reading some papers, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. So first of all, I've got two hands to show you. There's obviously the skeleton of the hand, okay? Two hands to show you there. The A one there, so the first one on the left, is from a tuatara. And if you don't know what a tuatara is, it's a lizard-like creature. It's not actually a lizard, but they live in New Zealand. They're critically endangered. They're really cool animals. They can live up to, we think, maybe even 200 years. Individuals, it's really crazy that these animals are here. There are many more fossil species of them, but today we only have one living species, okay? And then the other hand there is from a possum. And you've probably seen these before at some point. I saw, I think, at least 4 dead skunks on my way over here driving. It was pretty impressive, actually. And I did not see an armadillo, which I haven't spent enough time in Texas to see an armadillo, but it's on my list, okay? But you can see up here, the tuatara and the possum illustrate for us the general condition of reptile or mammal hands. So most reptiles have 5 fingers, just like you do, but the actual fingers are made up of a different number of bones than you. So our hands, you have 2 for your thumb, and then 3, 3, 3, 3. and you can count them to make sure, but that should be the case, okay? If it's not, we should talk about that. That'd be interesting. But 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, okay? And that's what possums have too. Most mammals have that. Of course, there's exceptions like horses because they only have one toe or finger, or whales, because they have these paddles instead. But most mammals have that condition of 2, 3, 3, 3, 3. Reptiles instead have 2, 3, 4, 5, 3. So there are two middle fingers, like one's long and one's even longer, and it has kind of an unusual look to it, okay? So like I've got a bearded dragon at home, and it especially stands out on the toes. I'm not showing you the toes here, but like 2 of the toes are really long, and it's not symmetrical across the one. Like ours is closer to being symmetrical, right? So it's really interesting, and they walk differently, and that is part of why this happens. And their feet, actually, the condition there is 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's 4. I don't remember at the moment, but definitely the hands are. So what happens if we look at non-mammalian synapsids? So here are hands here. First, we have Dimetrodon's hand, and Dimetrodon is 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, which is not shocking because it looks kind of like a reptile. We also have another hand up here, and this is from a Gorgonopsian, and this one is also 2, 3, 4, 5, 3. You say, well, then why are we talking about this? Because look at some of those finger bones there. They're really interesting. See the ones that are shaded in? Look how tiny they are. They're little tiny discs. In fact, when they were first found, they didn't even think that they were phalanges. They thought like maybe some extra bone like got inserted there or like it was messed up somehow. And they studied it, and they realized from looking at other specimens too, no, sure enough, they have really tiny phalanges. And sometimes they're even fused to another phalanx. And so the argument that's being made is that, hey, they're losing finger bones, phalanges, to become more like the mammalian condition. And you'll also notice there, we're not going to talk about carpals today, those are wrist bones, but you will notice that in mammals, the 4th and 5th distal carpal are fused to make one carpal, and the same is true in Gorgonopsians here. So you can see why someone would look at that and say, this is like a reptile hand becoming more like a mammal hand. And when you look at all of our different therapsids, so the 6 groups are represented here on this chart, you will see there's all kinds of conditions present. The mammalian condition, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, shows up in 5 different groups. Okay, so that's interesting. The Barominologians, we only have the reptilian condition. But the fun part is, okay, let me show you. Where are those groups? Okay, these guys. So there it goes. So you'd look at this at first and you'd say, if you're an evolutionist, you'd say, okay, the reptilian condition was in the pelycosaurs, it stayed in the Barominologians, and then before the rest of these therapsid groups evolved, the mammalian condition evolved, and then they kept it. Okay, that's what an evolutionist might say. But you run into a really interesting problem, because if you actually look at these groups in more detail, it turns out, yes, 5 of the groups have the mammalian condition, but those same 5 groups also have other conditions. Sometimes they have 2, 3, 4, 5, 3. Sometimes they have 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, or 2, 3, 3, 4, 3. And I sound like a computer, although it'll be zeros and ones. But they've got all these other kinds of conditions going on. And in fact, now we have even more fossils, and this chart would be even more complicated. So what is going on here? People have been arguing about this. So back in the 80s, there was a suggestion by Rowe and Van der Heever that what happened was the ancestor got the mammalian condition, and then some of its descendants reverted to a reptilian condition or did something weird. They did their own condition, okay? And that's really unusual. When evolutionists talk about evolution, something called Darwin's law, we tend not to think that animals are going to revert back to what they used to be. And so in the 90s, another solution was proposed by Hobson in 1995, and he said, here's what happened. The reptilian condition is ancestral, and the mammalian condition evolved at least 5 separate times, independently. So it evolved for these guys, and evolved for these guys, evolved for you get a car, like that's what it's like, okay? Everyone gets mammalian fingers at some point. Weird. Usually, right, we think of, when you hear the evolutionary story, right, if somebody told you, feathers evolved 8 times, you'd be like, that's kind of unusual. Why didn't it just evolve 1 time? Like, why would the same thing evolve on 5 separate groups? And This was proposed in the 90s as the best argument for this, and he tested it with phylogeny. He said, this phylogeny makes the most sense to me. It has the least number of reversions where you go back to the old state, and that was it. And so I tried looking in the literature for anyone like addressing this afterwards. Everyone just cites this paper. They're like, oh yeah, he figured it out. Like, it's good. We're done. And I think, like, that's odd. I mean, this is a really strange thing to happen. No one talks about why this happens. No one looks into it anymore. And the other thing is, it was never tested with stratigraphy, only with phylogeny. So let me show you what I'm talking about here, okay? What if we did the exact same thing Hobson did? We looked at all the different specimens, all their different numbers here, the 23333 and 23453 and all those kinds of fun things, and we tested them based on the order of appearance in the rock record. Okay, so if you look at the rock record, and I told you their fossil record is like this, the Therapsids and the Synapsids, they're in order. Okay, so like for instance, Dimetrodon you only ever find in the Carboniferous and the Permian. Gorgonopsians, you only ever find in the Permian. Cynodonts at the top there, you can find from the Permian all the way through the Cretaceous, okay? So what if we looked at their finger and toe numbers, the numbers of finger bones and toe bones in the hands and feet, and we compared that with the order of appearance in the fossil record, right? An evolutionist would say, well, yeah, we would expect the reptilian condition to appear first, and then over time, the mammalian condition would evolve. Okay? That's what you'd expect. That's what the phylogeny is telling you. And you would expect, if it really did evolve, 5 separate each one of those lineages, okay, as it's moving along there. So this is what, I read these papers and I thought, okay, I want to look at this. We should be able to find the data, accumulate it, make some kind of chart, and address this. And so I got a student to help me, and we... her name was Emily Scott. She just graduated. She's going to get married, but she wants to keep working on this, which is fun. And so we wanted to look at as many different animals as we could. Okay, so we ended up getting 42 taxa, like species or genus. So we had a few of the pelycosaurs, the Dimetrodon-like creatures, and then a bunch of different therapsids, especially cynodonts. We had 15 different ones for cynodonts. We were limited here, not out of, like we just stopped trying. We were limited based on how many hands and feet there actually are in the fossil record. Like, what have people found and actually described? Most of these are from South Africa. There's a few literature, and we tried to pull out, okay, what are all of the, where is this one precisely found in the rock record? That's what we're talking about with stratigraphy. Now, you might be like, okay, how certain can we be about these? So in Russia, things are a little bit complicated. I mean, that's actually true right now too, but that's not what I mean politically. I'm talking about, in stratigraphic record. And when you think about South Africa, though, it's really, really well resolved. So people have been digging, and they have been able to come up with these very specific, what are called assemblage zones, biozones, in the rock record. And they could say things like, this is the Eodicynodon assemblage zone. So every time we found Eodicynodon, it's shown up just in these layers right here. And the one above it is the Tapinocephalus assemblage zone. We only find its fossils in these ones. And so they've got really good data on where exactly they found these things, which is great. That works in our favor really, really well. And then our goal was, okay, let's represent these graphically somehow. And I kind of left that up to my student. I said, make something that makes sense to you, that expresses what we're seeing, okay? So I'm going to show you right now the charts that we got for hands and for feet, okay? So this is hands first. As you look across the, I guess we call it the x-axis, but across the top there, you can see geologic column, okay? So the Cretaceous, Carboniferous and Permian are on the left, and as you make your way along there, you go up the geologic column, so into the Permian, and then the Triassic, and then the Jurassic, and you can see the different assemblage zones from South Africa listed there as well. The vertical axis here, you can see the different digit states. So the top one there is 23453, that's the reptilian condition. Then we have 23443, 23343, 23333, which is the mammalian condition, and then the really weird 23322, which just some random Therocephalian had that. I don't know why. But the colors here correspond to the different groups, okay? And so anytime a group was present in there and had this particular state for its fingers, Mammaliaformes, that's the mammals, only have the mammalian condition. But if you're a therapsid group, you can have at least 2 different conditions present in your group, which is interesting. But the main thing I want you to notice here is 23453 and 23333, so the reptilian condition, the mammalian condition, show up simultaneously for therapsids. Okay, so yes, in the Carboniferous we do have pelycosaurs, but once you get therapsids in the Middle Permian, our reptilian condition and mammalian condition simultaneously. They show up just at the same time. That is not what you'd predict. You would predict the reptilian condition would show up first, and later on, the mammalian condition would show up. And that's not what you see. The only group that shows this is the teal up there, the cynodonts. The cynodonts never have the reptilian condition. They only ever have 23443 in the Upper Permian and Lower Triassic, and then they switch to a mammalian condition for the rest of the Triassic into the Jurassic. That's the only group that actually shows that kind of a transition. And the same pattern is true for feet. We see the exact same thing. Yes, the reptilian condition, 23454, and the mammalian on the bottom, 23333. Those, once you get therapsids, you have both conditions present. They're already there. And that is not what you'd expect from the conventional model. Okay, that's what's really surprising. So, what do we observe here? Just putting it out again, making sure it's clear. The mammalian digit formula shows up in multiple groups at the same interval as the reptilian one. Okay? You've got some anomalodonts with mammalian, some with reptilian. You've got some groups that only have reptilian or some groups that only have mammalian, but the thing is they all show up simultaneously in the rock record. You don't see a progression happening. Unusual, these intermediate conditions, right, that aren't reptilian and aren't mammal, they sometimes actually show up later than the mammalian condition. Look at this. I'll show you again. So for instance, 23443 shows up later, 23343 shows up right at the beginning, and 23322 shows up really late. So these other unusual conditions, same thing here, they can show up kind of randomly. They don't seem to really have a correspondence one way or the other of what's going on. And only our cynodonts, as I pointed out earlier, show an actual transition, show where it looks like, where it makes evolutionary sense, where they have a more reptilian hand, although they never have the true reptilian hand, and then a more mammalian hand, and the same thing with the feet, okay? So there are only a group that seems to show any kind of trend. What does all this mean? Thing, if you know the fossil record of therapsids at all. We have 6 therapsid groups, okay? 5 of them show up secular authors talk about this. So one of the main therapsid workers out there, his name is Thomas Kemp. He's from Britain. He wrote a paper in 2009 about this problem. And he said in there, the sudden appearance of therapsids is analogous to the Cambrian explosion and sudden appearance of mammals at KPG boundary, both of which creationists have jumped on as, hey, look, we're seeing, no progression, just sudden burst of animals in the fossil record. That's really encouraging. We've tried to make evolutionary trees of all therapsids together, and they never really work, and we all disagree. And he said the reason is because the major groups evolved within about 100,000 to 300,000 years of each other. And he says, therefore, it is an unresolvable polytomy. He says, no matter how hard we try, we don't have the data to resolve it because they evolved so fast, like an ideologic blink of an eye. And I think that's really interesting once again, because that's an interpretation you're imposing on the fossil record. Maybe it's right, but it's also entirely the other groups. They are actually their own unique groups showing up simultaneously in the rock record, which is more of a creationist position and prediction. Additionally, something else to notice here is that most of our groups have more than one condition present. So of the 6 therapsid groups, 5 of them have at least 2 conditions. Okay? So for instance, Gorgonopsians, some Gorgonopsians have the mammalian condition and some have the reptilian condition. I think, if I go back and look at it, I think all the Gorgonopsians we looked at had reptilian, only one had mammalian. Okay? And so you might be tempted to think, okay, well, maybe the ones with the reptilian condition are in one created kind and the ones with the mammalian condition are in a different created kind. Well, long before this, we had done barominology results for Gorgonopsians. And yeah, there are some separate groups, but it's not as clear as with the cynodonts. There's a lot of shared material there. And even when you look at the multidimensional scaling, yes, you can recognize 3 groups there, but they're not super, super distinct. And we have no outgroup here, so we have nothing to compare them to. And so when I published this back in 2017, I said, you know, it really looks like they're probably one created kind. Gorgonopsians look the same everywhere you look. They're just bigger or smaller. I did it backwards. Bigger or smaller. So they can get the size of a lion, they can be as small as a weasel, but they always look like a Gorgonopsian. I said I wouldn't be shocked if there's more than one created kind, but, you know, that's what I was thinking. Well, where does our one that has the mammalian condition show up? It's this guy right here, Arctognathus. Okay? Arctognathus, the closest thing to it is the animal Lycanops, right above it on the chart with the squares and circles there. In the multidimensional scaling, it's one of the 3 clustered farthest to the left. Okay, so the one with the mammalian condition is right next to one with the reptilian condition. They are not different from each other at all. They're very, very similar creatures. And so as a result, I think we have to say that, you know, if what we're doing is correct, within a single created kind of therapsid, there's variability. Some will have a mammalian condition, some will have a reptilian condition. And that's really, really interesting. So what does any of this actually mean then, right? We still haven't actually answered this question. What we have to say is this: variability in digit bones is very common for these creatures. They do not all, you know, for humans, I don't know how common it is. I don't think it's very common. Certainly wouldn't be common enough to show up in the fossil record, okay? But in therapsids, it's showing up. And it's not just fingers and toes that have some variability. The skulls of these creatures also vary. So one of the ones that we have the most fossils of all is a dicynodont called Lystrosaurus. And they vary from about this big to about that big, okay? Lystrosaurus, the front of the skull, so they're really weird, okay? They got a beak to start with, and their heads are smashed in, so it's kind of like a pug. But they do this weird biting thing where they have to bite down, and their jaws actually move like backwards like that. That's how they scrape up their food. And when you look at it, you say, oh, they've got these 2 nasal bones. They could kind of wobble, and that would be bad for the skull. Well, it turns out they're designed to reinforce that area. But depending on your individual, they reinforce it differently. Sometimes they use 2 bones together. Sometimes they have an extra bone there that no other animal has. Sometimes they just reinforce the other bones around it. So you have variability in different individuals, even in the same species there. So there's a lot of morphological variability in these things. They're, depending on individual to individual, species to species, there's some variation that's really interesting. So why is that? What's actually going on here? The story we were told is, oh, it's because obviously it's progressing from reptile to mammal. But that's not the case, because it's happening 5 separate times and there's no stratigraphic order to it. And so I don't think that's actually the case. Why is this happening then? Maybe we're just seeing developmental plasticity, that different animals kind of grow differently, and it's just individual variation. I don't think that's the only reason, because it looks like certain species, everybody does that. It's not just individuals. Could this be related to locomotion differences? Okay, so when you look at the mammalian hand condition, foot condition, it's really good for running over open terrain long distances. Okay, it's very even, and that, like, because mammals can continually run, reptiles typically don't do that. Reptiles are like these short bursts of activity, right? Like, I'm going to scamper over here, and then I stop. And I scamper over there, and I stop. And it turns out the reptilian hands and feet, the longer digits are out to the outside of the animal. And that really works for these like quick turns, and especially because of the way they move their bodies, it's really helpful. A reptile, the spine bends laterally. Okay, so when I watch my bearded dragon walk, he goes like this, and then he goes like that. He goes like that. That's how he walks, or even runs. For what's the word I'm looking for? Flexion in our vertebral column, that's dorsal-ventral. Okay, so if you watch a cheetah run, right, like in the nature programs, they always show this, and you see the cheetah like go up like an accordion, and it's really amazing, right? It's like the spine bends so much, and then it stretches out again. It bends vertically. Same thing with whales, right? Whales have that tail fluke like this because they move their tails up and down, whereas a shark is swimming more like a reptile would swim with the side-to-side motion, okay? So maybe it's related to that. Maybe some of our therapsids are living in more open territory, or they're living in more crowded territory, and so it makes more sense to have one hand or foot condition over another. So we started thinking about these possibilities. There's certainly other ones out there, and actually, if we'll talk about it in a minute. If you have any input, I'd love to hear it. But then, as we were discussing this, a new paper was published where they were looking at the spines, so the vertebral column, of reptiles, mammals, and non-mammalian synapsids. Okay, so I already told you reptiles move their spines side to side, mammals move them up and down. And so the thinking was that therapsids would show, and synapsids as a whole, would show a transitional state, right, where they're kind of moving side to side, kind of moving up and down. They'd show some kind of progression. And they were completely shocked when they got all the data together and they realized, nope, synapsids are just doing their own thing. They don't even care what reptiles and mammals are doing. So reptiles here are the green on this plot, mammals are the orange, and the non-mammalian synapsids are purple, okay? And so the prediction was that they would fall right in between the green and the orange, and they don't. They fall in their own section of this diagram, completely separate from them. Because it turns out non-mammalian synapsids have stiff spines. They don't really have much in terms of bending at all. And the part that they do bend, one part is more like a mammal and one part's more like reptile. And so they're walking on their own special way. And so now we're wondering, okay, is this part of a bigger story of how these animals are designed? That having this kind of spine and this kind of locomotion lends itself to... At this point, we don't know. This is still ongoing research. Like I told you, these are preliminary results. And if any of you, the more we do this research, especially as we're going to start getting into the jaws and the ears and things, we've discovered we need expertise in genetics, we need expertise in developmental biology, and we need expertise in modern biomechanics. And I don't have any of that expertise. And so these kinds of puzzles require this collaboration of a lot of different scientists. My background is paleontology. There's a lot I've learned already, but I'm realizing I'm going to have to start reaching out to more and more people. And so if you know people like that, or you yourself want to get involved, let me know. I'd love to talk about collaboration. But let me wrap things up. What do we learn here? Multiple groups of non-mammalian synapsids independently possess the mammalian digit formula, 5 different groups, which is unexpected. Secondly, there's no obvious stratigraphic pattern to the appearance of this, okay? This is encouraging. Both these things are encouraging me as a creationist because they are not what the evolutionary model would predict, okay? But they are consistent with what a creationist model would predict. And it's tempting at that point just to say, haha, we won, whatever. No, we're scientists. We want to investigate. We want to understand. Why is it like this? It's not enough just to say, well, they're wrong. Okay, we need another model. We need something else that can account for this. And so the reason for this variability in their digits is still very much a mystery. And like I said, if you have ideas, if you have things we can test, I'd love to look into it. The only living animal that has a similar spine to these things is the tuatara, which would be cool if tuataras weren't critically endangered, right? Because you can't really just go and get a tuatara and test it out in your lab. There's like only a few of them. They live in New Zealand, right? So it's going to be really difficult to do any kind of locomotion experiments with that. However, all of the data that those people used in that study, they did surface scans of every single vertebral column they looked at, living and extinct. So all that data is freely available to us. We can 3D print it. We can play around with it. So if you have ideas about that, I'd love to hear that. But I want to leave you with this encouraging note of knowing, hey, sometimes we see these problems as Christians in the sciences and we think, man, how could that ever be answered? And some people actually just give up. They're like, nope, I can't, I'm out. I'm just going to change my view on origins or change my view on Christianity. I'm out of here. And I would say, no, stick with it. Because we know that God's word is true. It comes from a true God. We can trust that. And as we investigate things in science, our perspectives change. We learn more things. We discover things we hadn't noticed before. And so there's a lot to go out there and find. We don't have to abandon things just because we don't understand. So thank you for all listening to me. And I think I'm supposed to do questions at this point. That's right.
We have time for questions. One thing that occurred to me as you were presenting this is
this is a classic case for epigenetic changes,
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things that are transitory, and that would be consistent with a group that displays both characteristics. But this isn't genetic at all, it's epigenetic. And we know that epigenetics is what affects the number of bones that you have in your finger, for example.
Right. Yeah, so that's where I was saying, like, I'd love to have somebody who does, genetic or developmental research on these things because, yeah, I personally don't know how those changes work, right? And that's, of course, one of the exciting fields is that we're discovering how many things we thought must be controlled by genetics but are actually epigenetic in nature. So, yeah, if, you've got ideas there in terms of how to research that, I am all ears for that. Other questions? Yes?
You did something similar with birds and bird-like dinosaurs. At this point, which grouping do you think is more of a challenge for creationists? Because your bird in this paper.
Yeah, so I don't know if everybody heard it, but the question was thinking about the dinosaur to bird evolutionary series versus this evolutionary series, which one is more troubling, I think, at this point, more difficult to think through. Honestly, I am not really all that concerned anymore with the dinosaur to bird series. I mean, I should be careful I say concerned. It's never been like I'm sitting at home like, can't sleep at night because I'm worried that like, oh no, what if they're right? No, I mean, like the Bible's true. But we did a study back in 2018 on creationism, and we did tons of barominology work and looked at the fossil record as well for dinosaurs to birds. There clearly are different created kinds, just like what we saw for the Therapsid group. It is punctuated. It's not a big spectrum. If you zoom out, it is, right? Just like if you zoom out really, really far, it's hard to tell the difference between a dog and a pig versus a tree, right? Like, yes, if you keep doing that. But if you zoom in, it's pretty obvious, okay, dogs are not pigs. Same kind of thing there. So the dinosaur to bird series, it's really not that good stratigraphically. Like, yes, you do find dinosaurs first and then birds, but you have things with like full wings, like Archaeopteryx and Anchiornis, before you have their close relatives in the fossil record. And when you look at the classic deposits in China where they find all these feathered dinosaurs and birds, I mean, you've got tons of different kinds of things buried in the same deposits, right? So you've got fully flight-capable animals, you've got animals that can't fly, you've got animals with teeth, animals with no teeth, all just buried together. So I don't really see that as a very convincing transitional sequence. This one is more challenging. So what we found was, if you look, so when I showed you guys that, here, let me pull it back up. Whoa. Hold on. Oh no, I broke it. Wait, almost there. Getting close, I promise. There we go. Okay, so if any challenge at all for a creationist model, really. I mean, of course, there's always scientific things to investigate, but those groups all appear simultaneously in the fossil record. They're already a problem for evolution. They have no, definite ancestry, and they're very, very unique and separate, and everyone agrees on that. So really, the only challenging part is the Synapsids to Mammal series, and I would say it is a challenge. It is very stratigraphic. We didn't look at jaws and teeth and stuff like that and ear bones, but it looks like a good sequence. And so we've been trying to work through that, what that means. I think that my personal guess on it is that it's very related to developmental biology. So when you think about, as I told you, as a mammal's developing, the ear bones, two of the ear bones are attached to the jaw with Meckel's cartilage, and they kind of, that dissolves away and they go and be part of the ear system. Maybe these creatures follow that same blueprint of development, but they have things that shut it off early during their development. So instead of those bones actually going and being part of the ear system, they stick on the jaw, basically, and develop that way instead of in the ears. And so I suspect it's something like that with blueprints, but we're going to need a lot more work. And like I said, we'll have to get a developmental biologist to help us out. Yeah. That was a lot. That was a long answer. That was like as long as my talk. So, yeah, it was a long, yeah. So actually, it's interesting to bring that up. I'll just mention our university has launched an online platform called Center for Thinking Biblically, and they're just putting up tons of content up there that's free that we're recording for it. And so I've actually got a series on dinosaurs on there. So it's like a episode thing on how to think biblically about dinosaurs, and there's a whole one on there about dinosaur bird evolution stuff. So if you want to know about that, you can also just come and talk to me. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, there's all kinds of other sequences.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the fish to reptile sequence.
Yep.
The land mammal to whale sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have similar problems? Do you know, or has anybody been able to look at them and stratigraphy?
Yeah. So what about other fossil sequences? So the general rule of thumb is if something is near the top of the column, the sequence looks more in line, whereas when you're getting lower in there, it looks more kind of out of order. The evolutionist attributes that to what's called the pull of the recent. Things more recently are preserved better than things that are older, whereas we might say maybe we're looking at changes in a post-flood world versus just burial during the flood. And so like a great example, you mentioned like the fish to amphibian sequence there. That one was claimed back in 2006 and in 2009 to be like one of the best sequences when they found Tiktaalik, this really interesting fish creature from the Arctic Circle. And then in 2010, they found footprints in Poland that were from a walking animal that were like 12 million years older than Tiktaalik. So, I mean, it's really, that one's a really cool example because the whole reason they found Tiktaalik was based on evolutionary prediction. So what they did is they said, we have fish in this layer, we have amphibians in this layer, there should be something in between. That they went out there and they found it. And so they said, look at that. That's the power of evolution, right? It really works. And it was touted that way. It was just, this is proof. And when they found those footprints that are completely out of order, then suddenly it's like, okay, well, how do we explain this, right? And once again, we can treat it like a gotcha moment kind of thing, but I think there's something more significant happening there because now the evolutionist is just like the creationist. They also have to explain animals in an order that looks like evolution when it's not. And that's why I'm really excited about that. I haven't heard anyone come up with a good answer for that yet, but there must be one, right? We've been saying that for decades now, that there are reasons for order in the fossil record that aren't just evolutionary. Whereas the evolutionists have said, oh, you guys are so silly, like, of course it's evolution, like, look at it. And now they're confronted with the same thing, with the fish to amphibian sequence. And so I'm kind of interested to see how they're gonna work through that. And I suspect it's gonna be preservation of different environments. And of course, we would say by the flood, they're gonna just say over time.
Well, is that to imply that it's an ecological donation?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking, is something along those lines. I mean, I think we have to remember the biggest thing is that a worldwide flood would be an incredibly complex thing. We just like to think of it as like, oh, the rains came down, the flood went up, and there's the ark with the giraffe sticking out of it, and like that was it. But you're talking about a year-long event. You're talking about plate tectonics happening. You're talking about, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff, volcanoes going off, possibly asteroid impacts during that time. It's going to be really, really complex. And so, you know, it's any model that we're going to come up with at this point is going to be too early. Today during lunch, I was reading a paper by Georges Cuvier back in the early 1800s, and he was an old Earth creationist. All they want to do is make systems and models, and they don't actually want to go out there and collect data. And I'm right there with him. I think in creation, we just automatically want to be like, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. And some of those are good models, but at the end of the day, I don't think we know enough yet about the fossil record to be very, very clear about, like, you know, this is exactly how the flood worked, or this is exactly how the post-flood world looked. I think we can get there. I think that as we do more better stories, and some things are really robust and good right now, but we still have a long ways to go, I think, on some of those areas. You know, you ask me, okay, what creationist is out there studying the fish to amphibian transition? Nobody, right? I don't know of anybody who's out there looking at those fossils. There's one publication I know of recently where they did barominology stuff with it, but they never actually went and looked at a single fossil because, you know, they were just writing based on the literature. We need someone trained in that area who can actually go out there and dig up those fossils themselves and study them. And I think, you know, when you look at creationism in general, we are way behind on number of people, on the amount of money, and the amount of time, right, that the evolutionists have had. We could complain about that, or we can say, God uses, what he uses, and he can accomplish much with very little, right? I think about Jonathan and his armor bearer. They go over there, and they see, hey, let's just go up. God can conquer with many or with a few, right? And so I took that question in a weird way, but nobody was giving me head shakes, so I just went for it. Any other questions? I came all the way out for California. No, I'm just kidding. It's fine. I understand. Okay. Okay.
Can we make even less sense out of the plants? I'm just thinking a little bit about the sequence of the appearance of flowering plants.
Yep.
And I'm not a paleobotanist or anything, but every once in a while I think about that. What does that look like?
Yep. Good question. So about the fossil record of plants. So I have an evolutionary colleague that I've written papers with before, Bob Bacher, and anytime he just gets bored, he sends me a text and he says, "What about pollen?" And he's constantly trying to challenge me about if the Bible were true, there should be pollen everywhere in the fossil record, and there's not. It's very restricted. It's only, like you said, the appearance of flowering plants is at a particular time. And so, once again, he's hoping that I'm just going to cave in and, oh, you're right, I give up and I recant. But no, I think those challenges are real and we have to work through them, but I don't think they're insurmountable. I think it's just we don't have the qualified people in the field, yet doing those things. So I will say the pre-angiosperm fossil record of plants, I think we actually have a very good explanation for that in a creationist model. And it has to do with there being, Kurt Wise came up with this in 2003, that there are these things called floating forests where you had extensions of plant material going off the continents in the pre-flood world. And he was able to do that, kind of what we did. He looked at the phylogeny of plants and he said, what is it that's controlling that? Water dependence in terms of reproduction. And so then he started thinking about it, and he started looking at these plants, and oh yeah, they're really weird. They're hollow. Oh, they don't have true roots. These can't grow in soil. And so when they started looking at all this stuff, they realized there's all these things that have been overlooked for the past 100 years because everyone automatically assumed uniformitarianism, automatically assumed evolution, and he came up with, I think, is a better model. For angiosperms, I think it's still a challenge. I'm becoming increasingly convinced, which of course I could change my opinion on this, but the more and more I think about it, I think that the pre-flood world was not a hospitable world for people. I don't think it was a great place to hang out for the most part. I think when you look at Genesis and it says that God cursed the ground, Adam would have to work hard, and there'd be the thorns and thistles come for him. You look at Lamech naming his son Noah, meaning rest, right? And he says he will give us rest from our toil on the ground. And then with the flood, the end of the flood, you see God says, never again will I curse the ground. I'm kind of man. And I think that there is something happening there where it looks like it's probably easier to grow the kinds of crops we eat in the post-flood world than the pre-flood world, is my suspicion. And I can't prove that at this stage. I was talking to one of our theologians at Masters, and he was pointing out to me, when you look at the flood narrative, the dove brings back an olive branch, right? And Moses could have said it brought back a plant. He didn't have to be that specific, because lots of times he's not, right? We don't even know his wife's name, right? It's not in the text. So he mentions an olive branch. Why is that significant? Olives are a crop. They're a cultivated plant. And so a cultivated plant growing in the wild, that's exciting, right? And I think the idea is that the world is more friendly to the kinds of plants that we eat now. And if that's the case, that may make sense of why pollen is not super common earlier in the fossil. I've been thinking about. That's the kind of thing that's been going on in my head. But I think it's interesting, and I think we could start heading in those directions. But I think the big point I'm trying to make is these problems seem insurmountable, they seem impossible, but many times that's just because we haven't been creative enough or we haven't actually gone out there and done the work. The great example I always think of is Leonard Brand and John Whitmore with the Coconino Sandstone. And everybody told him, oh, it's a desert, that you can get a desert in the middle of the flood. And now, I mean, the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of marine or just subaqueous, underwater origin for that sandstone. It can't be a desert. And so that's really encouraging. Once again, I think you can use that as a guidepost. Hey, I think we're on the right track, and we can stick with it. So it's International Conference on Creationism. It was the 2003 one. So I think and it's if you just Google it, the website will come up and it's there. It's managed now by Cedarville University in Ohio. But yeah, it's a really great paper. And since then, there's been some other ones that came out. There's the last International Conference on Creationism, so 2018. There were 2 papers by Roger Sanders, who is a botanist who just passed away, unfortunately, right before the conference, actually, and they kind of published it posthumously. But he co-authored it with Steve, the paleobotany of those plants that would make up a floating forest environment, showing that they really are hollow and they don't really have true roots. And then they also looked at an allochthonous origin for coal, so coal being transported in as opposed to growing in a swamp. And I think they make a very strong case for both of those things in those papers. And it's, unfortunate timing on Roger Sanders. I'd love for him to be able to continue that work, but that's where students come in, right? That's the exciting thing about universities like this, that we're training students to go out there and take up those research endeavors. A lot of good dinosaur research happening here, so it's exciting. Not to say there isn't other good research, that's just the only thing I know about, so not trying to make you feel bad if you're working on cells or something. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you once again for coming out. As I mentioned, Dr. McLean is doing some serious critical thinking, and I think it's very commendable that he's tackling some of the biggest questions in science. So I was blessed by that talk. Thank you. All right, have a